On December 13, 1995, the hunt ended. For weeks, police in several states had been searching for a man who had murdered 2 women and confessed to another murder. But on that cold winter morning, it was a simple phone call that changed everything. Kent Elmore, an acquaintance of the suspect, believed he had recognized him at a motel in California. Within hours, a SWAT team arrived. They surrounded the building, preparing for the worst. But Robert James Ackerman surrendered without resistance. As he was led away, he was calm, almost relieved. No one at that point had any idea how deep the abyss was that this man had opened up behind him. All the police knew was what they had heard on the news. 2 women murdered in Oregon, shots that appeared to be a targeted act of hatred. But when they questioned Robert, he opened up, almost willingly. He talked a lot, almost too much, as if he had been waiting for someone to finally listen. And what he had to say was even more terrifying than anyone had feared. Robert James Ackerman was born in 1968 and grew up in California. He was considered an intelligent student from an early age, but his interpersonal relationships remained difficult. At school, he was quiet, shy, sometimes absent. Friends later described him as socially awkward, someone who preferred computers to people. After high school, he studied business administration and worked at various companies, but never for long. It was as if he had never really found his place. In the mid-1990s, it seemed as if he was on the verge of financial success. He had invested in stocks and started a small business. But something went wrong. He lost money, and perhaps also control. And in the midst of this unstable phase, he met a woman who would change everything, Roxanne Ellis. What Robert was thinking or feeling in the days before the murders can only be reconstructed today. The only thing that is certain is that on December 4th, 1995, he lured Roxanne and her partner Michelle Abdil into a trap under false pretenses. A few days later, both women were found dead in the trunk of a car, shot with the same gun. The country was shocked. 2 women, openly lesbian, committed, popular in their community, and murdered in cold blood. At first, investigators were baffled. There were no signs of a break-in, no obvious motive. But now, with Robert in custody, the picture began to clear. During questioning, Robert Ackerman began to talk, and he hardly stopped. What the investigators heard sounded like the confused confession of a man who had long since lost himself. He spoke about money problems, about humiliation, about his desire to be someone. He kept returning to one topic: his relationship with a woman named Alla Kosova. Alla was a sex worker from Las Vegas whom Robert had visited regularly in the months before the murders. He spent thousands of dollars, booked luxurious hotel rooms, and bought expensive gifts. For him, Alla was more than just a sex worker. She was an obsession. But when his money ran out, he lost contact with her. Robert felt betrayed, used. He began to spin a new story in his head that he could only get the money back by pulling off a big coup. And that coup had a name: Roxanne Ellis. Roxanne worked as a real estate agent in Medford, Oregon, and was well known for her volunteer work in the queer community. Michelle Abdil, her partner, supported her in everything. Together they lived openly, committedly, and visibly, which Robert found provocative. A dangerous thought began to form in his mind. If he kidnapped Roxanne, blackmailed her, or even killed her, he might be able to make a statement or at least get some money. It was a mixture of delusion, hatred, and greed. On December 4th, 1995, Robert called Roxanne and pretended to be a potential buyer. They met in the late afternoon to view an apartment. But instead of a business deal, violence awaited her. Robert threatened her with a gun, tied her up, and forced her to call Michelle. She was also lured into the trap shortly afterwards. He took control of both women and drove them in Michelle's car to California, to his parents' house, which was empty at the time. There, in the garage, he held them captive overnight. The next morning, he killed them with shots to the head at close range. With the bodies in the trunk, he drove to Medford, Oregon. He parked Michelle's car in the parking lot of the South Ashland Apartments. It was not discovered until days later, with the bodies of the two women inside. The cold-blooded nature of this crime left even experienced investigators speechless. It was not a crime of passion, nor was it a dispute. It was planned, prepared, and carried out with clinical precision. The community was shaken. For Robert, however, it was not over. The next chapter was already beginning in his mind: the murder of Scott George, an old acquaintance from California. After disposing of the bodies, Robert did not stay long in Oregon. He drove back to California, where he stayed briefly with his mother in Walnut Creek. But the inner pressure grew. He spoke of feelings of guilt, but also of the feeling that there was no way out. His worldview was fragile. Reality had long since begun to crack. Robert kept talking about finishing something. No one knew exactly what that meant. Until December 11th. On that day, he made plans to meet Scott George, an old acquaintance from college. The two hadn't seen each other in years, but Robert had deliberately contacted him. In truth, it was not a harmless reunion. It was a trap. Scott George was gay. In Robert's confused mind, this became another reason for violence. He later said that Scott had hit on him, but this was never confirmed. It is more likely that Robert had a clear goal in mind: to prove his dominance, to exercise control, perhaps also to suppress his own inner conflicts. On the evening of December 11th, he killed Scott George in his apartment in Visalia. Again, it was an execution, cold and deliberate. Robert took a few valuables and fled. But this time he didn't stay calm. It almost seemed as if he wanted to be caught. 2 days later, on December 13th, 1995, a man named Kent Hensley saw an old acquaintance in a fast food restaurant in Redding, California. He was certain it was Robert Ackerman. Kent knew about the mugshots and had been following the news. He didn't hesitate to alert the police. What happened next was one of the most spectacular arrests of the year. A SWAT team arrived. The police cordoned off the area. Robert sat in a motel room, unaware of what was happening. When the door was broken down, he offered no resistance. He looked tired, empty, almost relieved. In his car, investigators found the gun used to commit the murders. Also in his pockets, a list of other names. Potential victims? No one knew for sure, but one thing was clear: if he hadn't been caught, there could have been more deaths. After his arrest on December 13, 1995, Robert James Ackerman was held in custody in California. The investigators were faced with a man who initially appeared withdrawn, but then became talkative, almost too talkative. Within a few days, he not only confessed to the murders of Scott George and the lesbian couple in Medford, but also began to openly explain his motives. It was a harrowing insight into a disturbed mind. Robert spoke of voices in his head, of missions he had to carry out. But beneath this confused surface lay a crude ideology. He repeatedly emphasized that he felt hatred toward homosexuals, especially toward men who reminded him of his own insecurity, and toward women who made him feel powerless. During questioning, Robert admitted that his real goal had been much greater. He had planned to carry out a series of purges, starting in California, then Oregon, perhaps even further north. He had compiled lists of names of people he believed to be gay, lesbian, or simply different. So the murders of Roxanne and Michelle were no accident. They were part of a frightening plan that he himself described as rational. The investigators were faced with a dilemma. On the one hand, they were dealing with a serial killer who had confessed to his crimes. On the other hand, Robert showed clear signs of mental illness. But was he really insane, or was he just manipulative? A forensic evaluation was ordered. The experts concluded that Robert probably suffered from narcissistic personality disorder and paranoid tendencies, but was criminally responsible. He knew what he was doing, and why. Meanwhile, the victims' families tried to come to terms with the incomprehensible. The relatives of Roxanne Ellis and Michelle Abdul in particular became the focus of media attention. The two women were well known in Medford, active in the community and politically engaged. Their deaths shook not only the town, but the entire LGBTQ community far beyond. The public began to ask questions. Could Robert have been stopped earlier? Why was a repeatedly failed businessman with delusions capable of killing so cold-bloodedly? In January 1996, Robert was transferred to Oregon to stand trial for the double murder of Roxanne and Michelle. The prosecution sought the death penalty. For many, this was the only just punishment. But the trial was not as straightforward as initially thought. The trial of Robert James Ackerman began in the fall of 1996 in Jackson County Circuit Court in Medford, Oregon. Security was tight and the courtroom was packed. Members of the LGBTQ community were particularly well represented, attending out of grief, protest, and a need for justice. The prosecution presented a man who had killed out of hatred, with a clear mind but a deep abyss within. The prosecution left no detail out. It described how Robert had selected his victims, deceived them, tied them up, intimidated them, and finally shot them in cold blood. It was an act, they argued, that was not only murder, but a targeted attack on a minority. The murders were an expression of a deep-rooted hatred that had erupted in targeted violence. The defense, on the other hand, painted a different picture. It tried to show that its client was mentally ill, a man who had lost touch with reality, plagued by paranoid thoughts, voices in his head, and a distorted perception of reality. Robert himself appeared changeable in the courtroom, at times calm and composed, then erratic, making confused remarks that brought the proceedings to a standstill on several occasions. A central theme was Robert's relationship with his father, a conservative military veteran who despised any form of weakness. Robert repeatedly emphasized that he had never been good enough, that he felt he had to prove his masculinity in a destructive way. His experiences with sex workers and the rejection he had experienced there also seemed to reinforce his self-hatred, but despite all attempts at explanation, the core of the crimes remained brutal. The jury listened to audio recordings of the interrogations in which Robert spoke about his motives with cold matter-of-factness. There was no remorse, only the conviction that he had set something right. On October 9, 1996, the court announced its verdict, guilty on all counts. The jury recommended the death penalty. Judge Rebecca Orff confirmed the verdict. Robert James Ackerman was officially sentenced to death. For many, it was a moment of satisfaction, but it was also a silent admission that hatred and violence do not only operate in the shadows, they are at the heart of our society. After his conviction, Robert James Ackerman was transferred to a high-security prison in Oregon, to death row. But although the verdict was clear, his case was far from over. Robert began to talk again, a lot. And with every new interview he gave, he cast himself in an even darker light. In a letter to a local newspaper, he claimed to have killed more people, 4, maybe 5. He didn't name names, no dates, just hints. Whether these confessions were true or the expression of a man who had lost all control remained unclear. But one thing was clear, his psyche was severely damaged. Robert's behavior became increasingly erratic. At times he spoke of remorse, then of pride. He complained about the death penalty but did not want to appeal. "I want to die," he wrote to a reporter. "I have nothing left to give." At the same time, he tried to publicize his case in the hope of at least being heard as a voice against the system. In prison, he was an isolated figure. Other inmates shunned him, and guards described him as unpredictable. His file continued to grow, not with legal proceedings, but with psychological assessments that spoke of severe personality disorders, narcissistic traits, and paranoid delusions. Robert James Ackerman died on October 19, 2018, at the age of 50, not by lethal injection as originally planned, but of natural causes. The death penalty was never carried out. He died alone in his cell, the same place where he had spent over 2 decades. For many, it was a quiet end to a harrowing story. No more courtroom drama, no new confessions, no last words, just the bland end of a man who had found his way into history through hatred, despair, and self-destruction. As a perpetrator, a symbol, a warning.